I never thought a pile of rotting wood and broken dreams could save me, but that's exactly what happened the day I found the cabin. It was 3 months after I'd left the force, 3 months since I'd turned in my badge, walked away from everything I'd built, and felt like I was drowning in silence. My canine partner, Rex, was the only constant I had left. He'd look at me with those dark, knowing eyes, and somehow that made the weight a little lighter. I was scrolling through property listings at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep again, when I saw it. $400. That's all they wanted for this forgotten piece of land, 2 hours outside the city. The photos showed a structure that barely deserved to be called a cabin, more like a skeleton of what used to be someone's shelter. Boarded windows, sagging porch, roof that looked like it might collapse if you stared at it too hard. Most people would have scrolled right past it, but I saw something else. I saw possibility. I saw a place where Rex and I could breathe again, away from the sirens and the memories and the constant reminder of why I couldn't do the job anymore. My hands were shaking when I called the number the next morning. The owner sounded surprised anyone was interested at all. He told me the cabin had been abandoned for over 15 years, that nobody wanted it, that I'd probably regret it. I didn't care. I needed this. I needed somewhere to start over. When I drove out there for the first time, my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the engine. The dirt road seemed to go on forever, trees pressing in from both sides like they were trying to swallow the path whole. And then, there it was, even more broken than the picture suggested. Paint peeled down to bare wood. Steps that creaked under my weight, like they might give way. Rex jumped out of the truck and immediately started exploring, nose to the ground, tail wagging with an energy I hadn't seen from him in months. And watching him, something loosened in my chest. Maybe we really could build something here. Maybe this crumbling, forgotten place was exactly what we needed. I signed the papers that same week. And if you're connecting with this journey, I'd love for you to subscribe and follow along as this story unfolds, because what happened next changed everything. Standing in front of that cabin with the keys in my hand, I had no idea what was waiting beneath our feet. The first time I stepped inside, the smell hit me like a wall. Damp wood, mildew, and something else I couldn't quite name. The scent of time itself, maybe, or just abandonment. Dust particles danced in the thin streams of sunlight that pushed through the cracks in the boarded windows, and I could hear Rex's nails clicking on the warped floorboards behind me. I stood there in what I assumed was once a living room, and I felt my chest tighten. What had I done? The ceiling had water stains spreading across it, like dark continents on a map. In the corner, there was actual daylight coming through a hole in the roof. I could see a patch of gray sky. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper with faded flowers that might have been cheerful once, decades ago. Now they just looked sad, like they were trying to hold on to a memory of better days. Every step I took felt uncertain. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I found myself testing each one before putting my full foot down, terrified one might give way and send me crashing into whatever darkness lay beneath. Rex had no such concerns. He moved through the space with confidence, sniffing every corner, every piece of forgotten furniture left behind. There was a kitchen to the left, if you could call it that. The sink was rust-stained and filled with dead leaves that had somehow found their way inside. Cabinet doors hung at odd angles, and when I opened one, a mouse darted out so fast I actually gasped and stumbled backward. My heart was racing. I pressed my hand against the counter to steady myself, and the wood felt soft, almost spongy under my palm. Rot. In the bedroom, just one, barely big enough for a bed. There was an old metal frame with springs exposed. no mattress. The window here wasn't boarded up, and I could see out into the overgrown yard. Trees everywhere. Wildness reclaiming what humans had once carved out. It should have felt peaceful, but instead, it felt lonely. Oppressive, even. I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall, and put my head in my hands. The reality was crushing. I'd spent nearly every dollar I had left on this place, and it was worse than I'd imagined. How was I supposed to fix this? I didn't have money for contractors, for materials, for anything, really. I'd pictured myself hammering nails, painting walls, building something with my own hands. But this wasn't a renovation project. This was a disaster. Rex came over and pressed his head against my knee, and I ran my fingers through his fur, trying to calm the panic rising in my throat. Maybe I'd made a terrible mistake. Maybe I should have just stayed in the city, found some other way to cope, some other way to move forward. But when I looked at Rex, when I saw how alert he was, how alive in this space despite its decay, I felt something shift. He trusted me. And maybe that had to be enough. I took a deep breath, stood up, and walked back outside. The porch was no better, missing boards, nails sticking up at dangerous angles. But the land stretched out before me, wild and endless and full of possibility. I didn't know it yet, but Rex was already working, already sensing what lay hidden here. And within hours, everything would change. It started that first night. I'd set up a camping cot in the least damaged corner of the cabin, too exhausted to care about the cold or the sounds of the old structure settling around me. Rex had his blanket beside me, and I'd fallen into a restless sleep, the kind where you're never quite sure if you're awake or dreaming. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to find his side of the floor empty. My heart jumped. Rex never wandered off at night. It wasn't like him. Years of training, of working together in situations where staying close meant staying alive, had made him almost an extension of myself. I sat up, straining to hear anything in the darkness. Then I heard it. Scratching. Not the sound of mice in the walls or branches against the windows. This was different, deliberate, urgent. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sound through the cabin, my breath visible in the cold air. The beam of light found him in what used to be a small storage room off the kitchen. He was at the floor, pawing at the boards with an intensity that made my stomach drop. This wasn't curiosity. This was his alert behavior. The same focused, driven energy he'd shown hundreds of times on the job when he'd detected something. "Rex, hey!" I called softly, trying to pull him back. "Come on, boy. There's nothing there." But he wouldn't stop. He looked at me briefly, his eyes catching the flashlight beam, and then went right back to scratching. His breathing was quick, excited. He let out a low whine that raised the hair on the back of my neck. I knelt beside him, running my hand over the floorboards he was fixated on. They felt different from the others. Looser, maybe, or newer. It was hard to tell in the dim light. "What is it?" I whispered, more to myself than to him. "What do you smell?" He barked once, sharp, insistent, a sound that meant, "Pay attention." My training kicked in before I could overthink it. I'd learned long ago to trust Rex's nose over my own assumptions. If he was alerting to something, there was something there. But what? The cabin had been empty for 15 years. Anything left behind would be long gone, wouldn't it? I tried to coax him away, to get him to settle down for the rest of the night, but it was useless. He kept returning to that spot over and over, scratching until I worried he'd hurt his paws. Finally, I gave up and let him stay there while I tried to sleep. But I couldn't. I lay on my cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to him work. The next morning, I examined the area in proper daylight. Rex sat nearby, watching me with an expression I'd seen countless times before. Patient, but expectant, like he was waiting for me to catch up to what he already knew. The floorboards here were definitely different, less weathered than the others around them, and when I pressed down on one, it shifted slightly, like it wasn't nailed down properly. My pulse quickened. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe the previous owner had done some repair work in this spot. Maybe there was just a draft coming up that Rex found interesting. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut. For the next 3 days, Rex's behavior only intensified. He'd lead me to that spot multiple times a day, refusing to eat until I acknowledged him, barely sleeping. I'd never seen him like this, so single-minded, so driven. It was the same energy he'd had on our most important cases, when we were searching for missing persons, when every second counted. But this wasn't a case. This was just an old cabin. Wasn't it? On the 4th night, I couldn't take it anymore. Rex woke me again with his scratching, and this time when I found him, he was whimpering. A sound of frustration I'd never heard from him before. He looked at me, then at the floor, then back at me, and I swear I could read his thoughts. "Why aren't you listening?" I sat down beside him, my hand on his head, and felt tears prick my eyes. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay, boy. I hear you. I believe you." Whatever was under those floorboards, we were going to find it, even if I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I woke up that morning with my mind made up. No more ignoring it. No more pretending Rex was just being strange or adjusting to the new place. I knew my dog, and he was telling me something was down there. I made coffee on my camping stove, my hands trembling slightly as I poured it. Rex sat by that spot in the storage room, hadn't moved all night as far as I could tell. His eyes followed me as I gathered what little tools I had. A crowbar I'd found in the truck, a hammer, work gloves. My mouth felt dry. Part of me wanted to call someone. The police, maybe. But what would I even say? My dog's been scratching at the floor? They'd think I was losing it. And maybe I was. Maybe 3 months of isolation and guilt and sleepless nights had finally caught up with me, and I was about to tear apart a floor based on nothing but a dog's instinct and my own unraveling mind. But when I knelt down beside Rex and looked into his eyes, I knew. He wasn't wrong. He'd never been wrong before. "All right, partner," I said quietly, my voice rough. "Let's see what you found." I wedged the crowbar under the first loose board. The wood resisted, groaning as I applied pressure, and then suddenly gave way with a crack that echoed through the empty cabin. Dust billowed up, making me cough. Rex's tail started wagging, his whole body tense with anticipation. The board came up easier than I expected, and I set it aside. Then the next one, and the next. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Beneath the floorboards was darkness. A crawl space, maybe, or some kind of foundation area. The smell that rose up was earthy and cold, like opening a grave. Rex immediately tried to push his head into the opening, but I held him back. "Wait, wait," I said, though my own hands were shaking. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it down into the hole. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. Shadows and shapes, uneven ground covered in dirt. I pulled up another board to widen the opening, and that's when the beam of light caught something that made my breath stop. Metal. The corner of something metal, partially buried in the dirt. "Oh, God," I whispered. Rex whined, his nose working overtime, and I had to physically restrain him to keep him from jumping down there. My training was screaming at me to stop, to not contaminate a potential scene. to call the authorities. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at that glint of metal, my mind racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was it a box? A safe? Or something else? Something that would explain why this cabin had been abandoned, why someone had been so eager to sell it for almost nothing, why they'd sounded so surprised when I called. I set the flashlight down, angling it into the hole, and lowered myself partway through the opening. The space was shallow, maybe 3 feet deep, but wide, stretching under most of the small room. My feet touched the cold earth below, and I crouched down, Rex's anxious panting loud above me. With my gloved hands, I started brushing away the dirt from the metal object. It was larger than I'd thought, roughly the size of a toolbox, and heavy when I tried to shift it. There was a handle on top, covered in rust and grime. My fingers found a latch. This was it. This was what Rex had been trying to show me for days. I pulled the box free from the dirt and lifted it up through the floorboards, my muscles straining with the weight. When I set it down on the floor beside the opening, we both just stared at it. Rex sniffed it carefully, then sat back and looked at me with an expression that seemed to say, "I told you so." The box was old, decades old from the look of it. Green paint flaking off metal that had rusted in places. There was no lock, just a simple latch mechanism that had corroded shut. I sat there on the floor, the crowbar in my hand, afraid to open it and afraid not to. What if this was nothing? Just old tools or documents someone had buried and forgotten. I'd feel like a fool for all this drama, for the sleepless nights and the anxiety. But what if it wasn't nothing? I looked at Rex, at his calm, satisfied demeanor, now that I'd finally listened to him. He'd done his job. Now it was time for me to do mine. I wedged the crowbar under the latch and pried it open. The metal screamed in protest, then gave way. I lifted the lid slowly, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. And when I saw what was inside, the world seemed to tilt sideways. I wasn't prepared for this. Nothing could have prepared me for this. Money, stacks and stacks of money, bound with rubber bands that had mostly disintegrated into brittle fragments. But that wasn't what made me fall backward. My hand over my mouth, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was what was underneath the money. Photographs, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, scattered and layered like fallen leaves. And documents, IDs, passports, newspaper clippings yellowed with age. I reached in with trembling hands and pulled out the first photograph my fingers touched. A young woman, smiling, dark hair. She couldn't have been more than 25. Written on the back in faded ink. Rachel M., 1987. I grabbed another, a different woman, blonde this time, standing in front of what looked like a college campus. Jennifer K., 1989. Another, and another. Each one a face. Each one a name. Each one a person who had lived and breathed and smiled for a camera without knowing their picture would end up here, buried beneath the floorboards of an abandoned cabin. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Rex pressed against my side, sensing my distress, but I couldn't comfort him. I couldn't do anything but stare at these faces, looking up at me from the past. The newspaper clippings were worse. I spread them out on the floor, my vision blurring as I tried to read them. Local woman missing. Search continues for teacher. Family pleads for information. Different papers, different dates, all from the late 80s and early 90s. Some of the faces in the photographs matched the faces in the articles. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The cabin suddenly felt too small, too close, like the walls were pressing in on me. I stumbled to my feet and made it outside just in time, doubling over on the porch, gasping for air. This was someone's collection, someone's trophies. I'd seen enough during my years on the force to know what I was looking at. Someone had lived here, or used this place, and they'd kept souvenirs of their crimes. The money was probably taken from victims. The photographs, the IDs, these were remembrances, evidence of lives stolen, families destroyed, questions that had never been answered. And I'd bought this place. I owned it now. This horror was mine. I don't know how long I sat there on those rotting porch steps, my head in my hands, trying to process what Rex had uncovered. An hour? 2? The sun moved across the sky, and I didn't move with it. I just sat there, frozen, while my mind raced through everything this meant. These women, if they were victims, if something terrible had happened to them, their families had never known. They'd spent decades wondering, hoping, grieving without closure. And the answers had been here all along, buried 3 feet under a floor that I'd been walking on for days. I thought about the person who'd sold me this cabin for $400. Had they known? Was that why they were so eager to get rid of it? Why they seemed surprised anyone wanted it? Or had they inherited it from someone, never knowing what secrets it held? My phone was in my pocket. I pulled it out, stared at it, my thumb hovering over the emergency call button. This was evidence. This was a crime scene. I needed to call the police immediately. Preserve everything. Let them handle it. But I sat there, paralyzed by something I couldn't quite name. Fear, maybe? Or responsibility? Or the weight of knowing that making that call would change everything. Not just for me, but for families who'd lived with unanswered questions for 30 years or more. Rex came out and sat beside me, resting his head on my knee. Good boy. Such a good boy. He'd done what he was trained to do, what his instincts had told him was right. He'd found what needed to be found. I scratched behind his ears, tears running down my face that I didn't bother to wipe away. You knew, I whispered to him. You knew there was something wrong here. The box sat inside, still open, its contents spread across the floor like pieces of a nightmare puzzle. I forced myself to stand, to go back in, to look at it again with clearer eyes. I needed to count how many photographs there were, how many different women. I needed to read through the clippings, understand the scope of what had been hidden here. 23 photographs of different women, 16 newspaper articles, 7 IDs from various states, and approximately $30,000 in cash, mostly 20s and 50s, bundled and buried like it didn't matter. But it was the last thing I found, tucked in the corner of the box beneath everything else, that made me sink to the floor again. A journal, small, leather-bound, the pages warped from moisture but still readable. And on the first page, in careful handwriting, "If you're reading this, then you've found my work. Let me tell you about the first one." I closed it immediately, my stomach churning. I couldn't read that. I couldn't bear to see inside the mind of whoever had written it. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This cabin held answers that people had been searching for since before I was born, and now it was my responsibility to make sure those answers reached the right people. I picked up my phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. "I need to report a discovery," I said when the operator answered, my voice barely steady. "I think I've found evidence related to multiple missing persons cases. Cold cases, probably from the 80s and 90s. As I gave them the address, Rex sat beside me, calm now, his work complete. He'd brought me here to heal. Instead, he'd uncovered the dead. The police arrived within 40 minutes, but it felt like days. I sat on the porch steps with Rex, unable to go back inside, unable to look at those faces again. When I heard the sirens cutting through the silence of the woods, I felt something break loose in my chest, relief mixed with dread. 2 patrol cars came first, then an unmarked sedan. A detective stepped out, a woman maybe in her 50s with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun. She introduced herself as Detective Marsh, and her eyes scanned the cabin with the kind of weariness that told me she'd seen too much in her career. "You're the one who called?" she asked, and I nodded. "Show me." I led her inside, my legs weak, and pointed to the open hole in the floor, the metal box. The photographs still spread out where I'd left them. She stopped in the doorway, and I watched her face change. All the professional distance dropped away for just a moment, replaced by something raw, shock, maybe, or recognition. "Jesus," she whispered. Then she pulled out her radio and called for more units, for crime scene techs, for people who knew how to handle what we'd found. Within 2 hours, the cabin was swarming with people. They strung yellow tape around the property, set up lights inside, took photographs of everything. I gave my statement 3 times to 3 different people, explaining how I'd bought the place, how Rex had alerted to the floor, how I'd found the box. Detective Marsh came back to me while I waited outside with Rex. She had a tablet in her hands and a look on her face that made my stomach knot. "I need to show you something," she said, sitting down beside me. "We've been running preliminary checks on the names and faces you found. This cabin, do you know who owned it before?" I shook my head. "The guy I bought it from said he inherited it. He didn't give me much detail." She pulled up a photo on her tablet. An older man, maybe in his 70s, with hollow eyes and a gaunt face. This was Harold Kettering. He owned this property from 1982 until his death last November. Natural causes. Heart failure in a nursing home. The name meant nothing to me, but the way she said it suggested it should have. "Harold Kettering was a long-haul trucker," she continued, her voice careful, measured. "He drove routes up and down the East Coast for 30 years, and during that time there were multiple missing persons cases along his routes, women who vanished from rest stops, truck stops, small towns along the highways. We never had enough to connect them. No bodies were ever found. No evidence. Just women who disappeared into thin air." My throat felt tight. "And you think he—" "We've suspected him for years," she said quietly. "But we could never prove anything. He was questioned twice in the 90s, but he had alibis, witnesses who placed him elsewhere. The cases went cold. And when he died, we thought whatever secrets he had died with him." She gestured back toward the cabin. "Until now. Those photographs you found? We've already matched 5 of them to open missing persons cases from 1987 to 1994. Women who were last seen along routes Kettering drove. And that journal?" She paused, her jaw tight. "That journal is a confession. Detailed accounts of at least 16 murders over a 12-year period. I felt like I'd been punched. 16 lives ended. 16 families left with nothing but questions and grief. And it had all happened here, in the place I'd chosen as my sanctuary. The son, the one who inherited the property and sold it to you, he had no idea," Detective Marsh continued. "He'd been estranged from his father for decades, never came out here. When Harold died, he just wanted to get rid of the property as quickly as possible. That's why it was so cheap." I looked at the cabin, at the investigators moving in and out like ants, carefully documenting every inch. This structure that I'd seen as broken and forgotten had been something much darker. A hiding place for evil, a monument to suffering that no one had ever suspected. What happens now? I asked, my voice hoarse. We process everything, she said. The journal gives us locations, places where he said where remains might be found. This could give closure to families who've been waiting 30, 40 years for answers. You've given them that. You and your dog. She reached over and scratched Rex behind the ears, and he leaned into her touch, oblivious to the magnitude of what he'd uncovered. The property's going to be tied up as evidence for months, maybe longer, Detective Marsh said, standing up. I'm sorry, but you won't be able to live here during the investigation. And honestly, she looked at me with something like sympathy. I'm not sure you'd want to. She was right. I couldn't imagine sleeping here again. Couldn't imagine walking across those floors knowing what they'd hidden. The cabin that was supposed to be my fresh start had become a tomb of memories I'd never wanted to inherit. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the property, they brought out the box, sealed now in evidence bags. Then they started carefully removing sections of the floor, expanding the search. One of the techs called out that they'd found something else, another smaller box, deeper in the crawl space. I turned away. I couldn't watch anymore. Detective Marsh gave me her card before she left, told me to call if I remembered anything else, thanked me again for coming forward. But as I sat there with Rex, watching the investigation unfold around the cabin I'd bought for $400, all I could think about was Harold Kettering. He'd driven those highways for years, living a normal life on the surface while collecting trophies from the lives he'd stolen. He'd died peacefully in a nursing home, never facing justice, never paying for what he'd done, and he'd almost gotten away with it completely. If I hadn't bought this place, if Rex hadn't alerted, if I hadn't listened, the secrets would have stayed buried forever, and those families would have never known. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt sick and hollow and impossibly sad for women whose names I now knew, whose smiling faces I'd never forget. But at least now, finally, they could come home. The investigation consumed the next 6 weeks of my life in ways I never could have anticipated. Detective Marsh called me almost daily with updates, questions, requests to walk through the property again, to remember details I might have overlooked. The cabin became a focal point for something much larger than I'd imagined, a multi-state task force coordinating with cold case units from Virginia to Maine. I wasn't allowed back on the property, so I rented a small room in a motel 20 minutes away. Rex and I fell into a strange routine. Morning walks, long afternoons waiting for phone calls, evenings spent watching the news as the story began to break nationally. Trucker's House of Horrors. Decades of murder uncovered in rural cabin. The headlines made my skin crawl, but it was the families that haunted me most. Detective Marsh asked if I'd be willing to meet with some of them, the relatives of the women whose photographs I'd found. I said yes before I could think better of it. How could I say no to people who'd been waiting for answers since before I was born? The first family came on a cold afternoon in late February. Margaret Chen, the mother of one of the victims, Lisa Chen, who'd disappeared in 1989 at age 23. She was elderly now, her hands shaking as I opened the door to let her and her son into the motel's small conference room they'd arranged for us. "Thank you," she said, before I could even introduce myself, her voice breaking on the words. "Thank you for finding her." I didn't know what to say. I hadn't found her daughter, not really. I'd just bought a cabin and listened to my dog. But as Mrs. Chen sat down across from me, tears streaming down her weathered face, I understood that it didn't matter how it happened. What mattered was that she finally knew. "For 36 years, I wondered," she said, her son's hand on her shoulder. Every day, every single day, I thought maybe she'd walk through the door. Maybe she'd call. Maybe she was alive somewhere with amnesia, or she'd run away and would come back when she was ready. The not knowing was— She pressed her hand to her chest. It was a special kind of torture. She told me about Lisa, how she'd been driving from Boston to visit a friend in North Carolina, how she'd called from a rest stop in Virginia to say she'd be there by morning, how that was the last time anyone ever heard from her. The police said she probably just left, started a new life. Mrs. Chen continued, anger flashing in her eyes. They said young women do that sometimes, but I knew my daughter. She wouldn't have done that. She wouldn't have let me suffer like this if she had a choice. Her son showed me photographs on his phone. Lisa as a child, as a teenager, graduation photos, pictures of a vibrant young woman with her whole life ahead of her. The same woman whose photograph I'd held in my hands, whose face I'd memorized without meaning to. The detective said that because of what you found, they know where to look now, he said quietly. The journal had locations. They're searching a wooded area off Highway 95, about 40 miles from where Mom's last call came from. They think they'll find her soon. I felt tears burning in my eyes. I'm so sorry, I whispered. I'm so sorry this happened to her. To all of you. Mrs. Chen reached across the table and took my hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. You gave her back to me, she said. After all these years, I can finally bring my baby home. I can finally lay her to rest. 3 more families came over the following weeks. Each meeting was harder than the last. A father who'd never stopped searching for his daughter. A sister who'd spent decades feeling guilty for the fight they'd had the day before she disappeared. A husband who'd remarried, but never stopped wondering what had happened to his first wife. They all said the same thing in different ways. The not knowing had been unbearable. The questions without answers had poisoned their lives, made it impossible to fully grieve, to fully move forward. And now, finally, they could. But the investigation revealed something else, too. Something that made the scope of Harold Kettering's crimes even more staggering. Detective Marsh called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice tight. We've found 4 more potential victims, she said. Women whose disappearances fit his pattern, his roots, his timeline. But their photographs weren't in the box you found. What does that mean? I asked, though part of me already knew. It means there might be more, she said. More boxes, more hiding places. The property's only 2 acres, but it's heavily wooded. We're bringing in ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs. We need to search every inch. They found the second box 3 days later, buried near the tree line at the back of the property. Then a third, smaller one, hidden in the stone foundation of what had once been a shed. Each one contained more photographs, more identification cards, more evidence of lives stolen and hidden away like secrets. The final count was 29 women, 29 families who would finally have answers. 29 cases that had gone cold, that had been filed away and forgotten by everyone except the people who'd loved them. And Harold Kettering had died peacefully, never facing any of it. The injustice of that ate at me. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, thinking about him driving those highways, choosing his victims, knowing he was getting away with it. How had no one caught him? How had he been so careful, so methodical, that he'd evaded justice for his entire life? Detective Marsh tried to explain it when I asked. He was smart, she said, frustration evident in her voice. He picked victims who were traveling alone, who wouldn't be missed immediately. He varied his patterns just enough that we couldn't establish a clear signature. And frankly, in the 80s and 90s, different jurisdictions didn't communicate the way they do now. A missing person in Virginia didn't automatically get connected to one in Maryland or North Carolina. "But you suspected him," I said. "We did. But suspicion isn't evidence. We interviewed him twice, searched his truck once. We found nothing. He was always cooperative, always had an explanation. And without bodies, without physical evidence linking him to any of the disappearances, we couldn't build a case." She paused, and I heard the weight of years in her silence. "A lot of us carried those cases with us," she said finally. "The ones we couldn't solve. The families we couldn't help. I've been on the force for 28 years, and there are faces I still see when I close my eyes. Women I failed to find." "You didn't fail," I said quietly. He was evil, and he was careful." "Maybe, but that doesn't make it easier." I understood that. Even though I'd done nothing wrong, even though I'd helped uncover the truth, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd somehow become part of this horror. The cabin was mine. The property was mine. And even though I'd never met Harold Kettering, never knew he existed until after he was dead, I felt connected to his crimes in a way I couldn't explain. Rex sensed my darkness during those weeks. He stayed closer than usual, watched me with worried eyes, pressed against my legs when the weight of it all became too much. He'd done his job. He'd found what needed to be found. But neither of us had anticipated what it would cost. I never told anyone that I'd left the K-9 unit because I'd failed. Not failed in the way most people would understand. I hadn't made a mistake, hadn't missed a signal, hadn't broken protocol. But there was a case. One case that had broken something inside me. And that's what made Rex's discovery at the cabin feel like some kind of cosmic reckoning. It was 18 months before I bought the cabin. Rex and I had been called to search for a missing teenager, Emily Hartwell, 15 years old, vanished after school. We'd searched for 3 days straight. Wooded areas, abandoned buildings, anywhere she might be. Rex had been working perfectly, as he always did. But we found nothing. No scent trail, no trace, nothing. 2 weeks later, they found her body in a storage unit less than a mile from where we'd searched. The suspect had moved her there after we'd already cleared that area. If we'd been faster, if we'd expanded our search radius sooner, if I'd pushed harder. The department told me it wasn't my fault. My captain told me you can't save everyone. My colleagues told me I'd done everything right. But when I looked at Emily's parents at the funeral, when I saw their hollow, destroyed faces, all I could think was, I failed them. Rex and I were supposed to find her, and we didn't. That's when the insomnia started. The replaying of every decision, every moment of that search. The constant questioning. What if I'd gone left instead of right? What if I'd trusted Rex's behavior at that one intersection differently? What if? 6 months later, I turned in my badge. I told everyone I needed a break, needed time to recharge. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. I couldn't trust myself anymore. I was terrified that I'd miss something again, that another family would be destroyed because I wasn't good enough, wasn't smart enough, wasn't enough. Rex knew, of course. Dogs always know. He'd watch me during those long, sleepless nights, and I'd see the confusion in his eyes. He didn't understand why we'd stopped working, why we'd abandoned the thing we were meant to do together. And then, the cabin happened. When Rex first started alerting to that floor, part of me wanted to ignore it, because I was afraid. Afraid I'd misread him. Afraid I'd tear apart the cabin based on my interpretation of his behavior and find nothing. proving once again that I wasn't competent enough for this work, afraid that my training, my instincts, everything I'd built my identity around was fundamentally flawed. But Rex had been insistent in a way I'd rarely seen, and that's when I realized something. This wasn't about me. It had never been about me. Rex didn't doubt himself. Rex didn't replay scenarios or question his abilities or wonder if he was good enough. Rex simply did what he was trained to do, what his instincts told him was right, and he trusted that I would eventually listen. My training advantage as a canine handler, all those years of learning to read canine behavior, to understand scent work, to interpret the subtle signals that most people would miss, that's what made me finally pay attention. I recognized his alert posture, the focused intensity, the specific way he kept returning to that exact spot. Those weren't the behaviors of a dog who was bored or confused. Those were the behaviors of a dog who'd found something significant. Any other person might have assumed he'd detected a dead mouse or was just being odd in the new environment. But I knew better. I knew Rex. And my professional experience told me that his behavior meant something real was there. When I finally pried up those floorboards and found the metal box, when I saw what was inside, I understood why Rex had been so persistent. The scent profile down there must have been overwhelming for him. Old papers, deteriorating rubber bands, metal corrosion, and probably traces of human scent embedded in the photographs and documents, even after all these years. For a dog trained in detection work, it would have been impossible to ignore. Detective Marsh commented on it during one of our conversations. "Your dog's training saved lives," she said. "Well, gave them back, in a way. Another person would have bought this property, maybe even done renovations, and never known what was under those floors. Those families would have never gotten closure." She was right, but it was more than just Rex's training. It was the partnership we'd built over years of working together. It was my ability to read him, to trust him even when I didn't trust myself. It was the combination of his natural abilities and my professional knowledge that made the discovery possible. And maybe that's what I'd forgotten after Emily Hartwell. I'd been so focused on my failure that I'd forgotten all the successes, all the people we had found, all the cases we had helped solve, all the families we had brought closure to over the years. Rex hadn't failed on that case. I hadn't failed. Sometimes the circumstances are impossible, and the outcome is beyond anyone's control. But we'd still done our job to the best of our abilities. At the cabin, Rex did his job again, and this time, I listened. One evening, after a particularly difficult meeting with another victim's family, I sat on the motel room floor with Rex and just held him. I pressed my face into his fur and cried. For Emily Hartwell, for the 29 women whose photographs I'd found, for all the pain and loss and unanswered questions that had led us to this moment. "You're such a good boy," I whispered to him. "You've always been such a good boy. I'm sorry I forgot that." He licked my face, his tail wagging, and I felt something shift inside me. Not healing, exactly, but maybe the beginning of it. My training had taught me to read dogs, to understand their signals, to work as a team with an animal whose senses and instincts far exceeded my own. But Rex had taught me something deeper. Trust. Trust in the partnership. Trust in the work. Trust that even when things go wrong, even when you can't save everyone, you still show up and do the job because someone needs to. Detective Marsh called the next day with news that they'd positively identified remains at one of the locations from Harold Kettering's journal. Lisa Chen was coming home, just like her mother had prayed for. "None of this would have happened without you and your dog," Detective Marsh said. "I hope you know that." "It was all Rex," I said quietly. "No," she replied firmly. It was both of you. He found it, but you knew what it meant. You understood his behavior because of your training and experience. That's not nothing. That's everything. After we hung up, I looked at Rex, who was lying on his bed chewing a toy, completely content and unbothered by the magnitude of what he'd accomplished. Maybe she was right. Maybe it wasn't just about Rex's nose or my training. Maybe it was about the fact that we'd found each other, that we'd become a team, and that even in our brokenness, mine emotional, his just confused about why we'd stopped working, we'd still managed to do something that mattered. The cabin had been supposed to be my escape from the job I thought I'd failed at. Instead, it became proof that I'd never really left it behind. And maybe I wasn't supposed to. The property value question came up about 3 months after the discovery, though by then, property value felt like an obscenely trivial concern compared to everything else. My lawyer called me on a Wednesday morning. I'd hired him to help navigate the legal complexities of owning a property that had become a crime scene, and his voice on the phone had that careful, measured tone that lawyers use when they're about to tell you something you don't want to hear. "We need to talk about your options regarding the cabin," he said. "The investigation is winding down. They'll be releasing the property back to you within the next month or so." I sat down on the motel bed, Rex at my feet. "Okay," I said, though nothing about this felt okay. "Here's the situation," he continued. "Legally, you own the property free and clear. You purchased it in good faith, had no knowledge of its history. But realistically, we need to discuss what happens next." "Ike, what happens next?" As if there was a normal procedure for this, a playbook for what to do when your $400 fresh start turns out to be a burial ground for secrets. He explained it to me in practical terms. The property was now infamous. The media attention had been relentless. News vans had been parked on the access road for weeks, helicopters had flown overhead during the searches, and true crime podcasts were already producing episodes about the truck stop killer's cabin. "Oh, team," my name had been kept out of most reports, but locally everyone knew who I was and what I'd found. Properties with this kind of history typically experience severe devaluation, my lawyer said. Stigmatized properties, they're called. Houses where murders occurred, where bodies were found. They sell for significantly less than market value, if they sell at all. I almost laughed at the absurdity. Less than $400? How much less could it possibly go? But then he explained what he meant. The land itself, 2 acres in a relatively rural but accessible area, would have normally been worth somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000, even with a decrepit cabin on it. Location, privacy, potential for development. Under normal circumstances, I'd made an incredible investment, even if the cabin was unsalvageable. But these weren't normal circumstances. There are 3 basic options, he said. 1, you can try to sell it, but you'll be legally required to disclose its history. Most buyers will walk away immediately. The few who might be interested will be looking for a bargain. We're talking maybe $5,000 to $10,000 at most, and that's optimistic. $5,000 to $10,000. Still more than I'd paid, technically a profit, but the number felt meaningless. 2, you can hold on to it long-term and hope the stigma fades with time. Sometimes properties can recover their value after decades, when the story becomes more historical than immediate. But you'd have to pay property taxes on land you're not using, and there's no guarantee the value would ever recover. I thought about paying taxes for years on a property I could never set foot on again. A place that existed in my nightmares more vividly than it ever had in reality. 3, you can have the structures demolished and sell it as vacant land. That might reduce the stigma somewhat, remove the physical reminder of what happened there. But demolition costs money. and even vacant land with this history will be difficult to move. After he hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. Rex nudged my hand with his nose, and I scratched his ears absently. The irony was crushing. I'd bought the cabin because I was broke, desperate, looking for the cheapest possible way to start over. That $400 had been almost everything I had left after months of unemployment, after paying rent on an apartment I'd eventually abandoned, after letting my savings drain away while I tried to figure out who I was without the job that had defined me. And now I owned property that was worth far more than I'd paid, but was simultaneously worthless. Detective Marsh stopped by the motel a few days later. We'd developed an odd friendship through all of this, bonded by the strange circumstances that had brought us together. She brought coffee and sat across from me in the small breakfast area. "I heard your lawyer called," she said, "about the property situation." Word traveled fast in small towns. I nodded. "I want you to know something," she said, leaning forward. "What you found there, what Rex found, it's going to bring closure to 29 families. We've recovered remains at 7 locations so far, with more searches planned. We've closed cases that have been open for 40 years. That has value that can't be measured in dollars." I knew she was trying to help, but it didn't change the practical reality. I was living in a motel I could barely afford, with a dog and no job and a piece of property I couldn't use and couldn't sell. "The department wants to do something," she continued. "Officially recognize your contribution, maybe some kind of civilian commendation. And there's been talk of a reward. Some of the families want to pool together money to thank you." "No," I said immediately. The word came out harsher than I intended. "I don't want money from those families. They've suffered enough. They don't owe me anything." "They want to help," she said gently. "They see what this has cost you." But that was the problem, wasn't it? I couldn't take money from people whose daughters and sisters and wives had been murdered. It felt obscene, like profiting from tragedy. Even though I'd done nothing wrong, even though finding the evidence had been the right thing to do, accepting payment for it felt like crossing a line I couldn't come back from. The media requests didn't help. Producers calling, wanting to do interviews, offering payment for my story. True crime shows wanting to film on the property, to dramatize the discovery, to turn the worst moments of 29 women's lives into entertainment. I said no to all of it. A real estate agent from 2 towns over reached out, someone who specialized in difficult properties. She was blunt in a way I almost appreciated. "I'll be honest with you," she said during our phone call. "This property is going to be almost impossible to sell through traditional channels. But there is a niche market, people who are drawn to dark history, who want to own a piece of something infamous. Collectors, in a way." The idea made me physically ill. Selling to someone who wanted it because of what had happened there, who would treat it like a macabre souvenir. No, absolutely not. "There's also the possibility of selling to a victims' advocacy group," she continued. "Sometimes organizations will purchase properties like this to turn them into memorials, or to simply ensure they don't fall into the wrong hands. But those sales typically happen at a significant loss." I thought about that for days. A memorial. A place where families could come to remember, to grieve, to find some kind of peace. It felt right in a way that nothing else did. But when I mentioned it to Detective Marsh, she shook her head sadly. "Most families want to forget these places exist," she said. "They want their loved ones remembered for how they lived, not where their killer kept trophies. A memorial here? I don't think it would bring comfort. I think it would just be another reminder of horror." So I was stuck. Property I couldn't sell, couldn't use, couldn't transform into something meaningful. A $400 purchase that had turned into a 400-pound weight around my neck. The final blow came from an unexpected source. The county assessor's office sent me a letter informing me that my property taxes were being reevaluated based on the land's actual value, not the distressed sale price I'd paid. Despite the stigma, despite everything, the acreage itself still had baseline worth. My annual property tax bill would be nearly $2,000. I couldn't afford it. Not even close. Late one night, I sat on the motel room floor with Rex and cried. Not the cathartic, healing tears I'd shed before, but tears of frustration and defeat. I'd tried to do the right thing. I'd reported what I'd found. I'd cooperated with the investigation, met with families, relived the trauma over and over. And somehow, I'd ended up worse off than when I started. Rex licked the tears off my face, and I held him close. We did good, didn't we, boy? I whispered. Even if it cost us everything, we did good. He wagged his tail because for him, it was simple. We'd found something that needed to be found. The rest was just details. But I was human, and the details mattered. The details were drowning me. I didn't know it yet, but sometimes doing the right thing opens doors you never expected. Sometimes the cost of truth is high, but the value of it, the real value, can't be measured in property assessments or market rates. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what actually matters. I just wasn't there yet. The first lesson came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman whose daughter Lisa had been one of Harold Kettering's victims. She called me about 4 months after our first meeting, her voice stronger than I remembered. I wanted you to know, she said. They found her. They brought my Lisa home. I sat down, my hand pressed to my chest. I'm so glad, I managed to say. We're having a funeral next week. A real funeral, finally, and I wanted to invite you, if you'd be willing to come. I went, though every instinct told me I didn't belong there. Rex came with me, and as we stood in the back of the small church, I watched a family finally say goodbye to someone they'd lost nearly 40 years ago. The grief was immense, but there was something else, too. A kind of peace I hadn't expected to see. After the service, Mrs. Chen found me. She took both my hands in hers and looked at me with eyes that had seen too much suffering, but somehow still held kindness. You gave me the greatest gift, she said. You let me stop wondering. For 36 years, I imagined 1,000 different scenarios. That she was suffering somewhere, that she needed me and I couldn't reach her, that she was alive and had forgotten about me. The not knowing was a special torture that colored every single day of my life. Her grip tightened. Now I know. It's terrible what happened to her. But at least I know. At least I could hold her one more time, even if it was just bones and remnants. At least I could tell her goodbye. At least she's not lost anymore. She pressed something into my hand, a card with her phone number. If you ever need anything, she said, anything at all, you call me. You're part of our family now, whether you intended to be or not. I cried the whole drive back to the motel. The second lesson came from Detective Marsh, during one of our last official meetings as the investigation formally closed. I've been doing this for 28 years, she said, and I've learned that you can't control outcomes. You can only control effort and intention. You did everything right on that case with Emily Hartwell. I pulled the files, read through everything. Your search patterns were textbook. Your coordination with the team was flawless. The suspect moved her after you'd cleared that area. There's nothing you could have done differently. But she died, I said, my voice breaking on the words I'd never said aloud. She died because someone murdered her, Detective Marsh said firmly. Not because you failed. Not because your dog failed. You cannot carry responsibility for evil that other people commit. That weight will destroy you. She leaned back in her chair, and I saw exhaustion in every line of her face. I've had to learn that lesson over and over. Every unsolved case, every victim I couldn't save, I used to carry them all. Until my therapist finally made me understand that I'm not God. I can't control everything. I can only show up and do my best. And some days, my best won't be enough. And that has to be okay, because the alternative is quitting. And if I quit, if you quit, then who does this work? I did quit, I whispered. And then you came back, she said. Maybe not in the way you expected, but you came back. You trusted your training. You listened to your dog. You did the work, even though you were terrified and broken and convinced you weren't good enough. That's not failure. That's courage. The third lesson came from Rex himself, though it took me months to fully understand it. Dogs don't second-guess themselves. Dogs don't replay scenarios or wonder what might have been different. Rex had alerted to that floor because he detected something unusual, and then he'd waited patiently for me to catch up to what he already knew. He didn't doubt his abilities. He didn't wonder if he was good enough. He simply was what he was, a well-trained detection dog doing the work he'd been bred and trained to do. And when I finally listened to him, when I trusted his instincts over my own fears, everything changed. Not just for those 29 families, but for me. I'd spent 18 months believing I wasn't capable of this work anymore, believing that my failure with Emily Hartwell had somehow invalidated all the successes that came before, all the people Rex and I had helped over the years. But Rex had never doubted. Rex had just been waiting for me to remember who we were together. The fourth lesson was the hardest. Sometimes the right thing costs everything, and you do it anyway. I couldn't afford to keep the property. I couldn't sell it without feeling like I was profiting from tragedy. So I made a decision that my lawyer thought was insane, and my accountant said was financial suicide. I donated it. Not to a victims group or a memorial organization. Detective Marsh had been right, that most families didn't want that. Instead, I donated it to a search and rescue training organization, a nonprofit that trained K-9 units for police departments and volunteer search teams. They were hesitant at first, concerned about the property's history. But when I explained my reasoning, something shifted. This is where Rex remembered what he was, I said. This is where we both remembered. Maybe it can be a place where other handlers and dogs learn to trust each other. Maybe something good can grow here after all. They accepted. The cabin would be demolished, the land cleared, and they'd build a training facility, obstacle courses for dogs, classrooms for handlers, areas to practice scent detection and tracking. The property that had hidden Harold Kettering's secrets would become a place where people learned to uncover truth, to find the lost, to bring families home. I got nothing financially from the donation. Tax deduction, my accountant said, but it was meaningless since I barely had income to deduct from. I signed the papers knowing I was walking away with less money than I'd started with, still living in a motel, still unemployed, still struggling. But I walked away with something else. The knowledge that 29 families had closure. The knowledge that Rex and I had done what we were meant to do. The knowledge that the partnership I'd thought was broken had actually been stronger than I'd ever realized. And maybe most importantly, the knowledge that failure isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's just a chapter you have to get through before you can write the next one. Detective Marsh helped me get my K-9 handler certification reinstated. She made calls, wrote recommendations, vouched for my competence. 3 months after I donated the property, I started working with a police department 2 counties over, partnered with a new dog, a young German shepherd named Dakota, who reminded me so much of Rex in his prime. Rex retired officially, though he still came to work with me sometimes, the old veteran showing the youngster how it was done. And on his good days, when his arthritis wasn't bothering him, I'd watch him move through training exercises with Dakota and see the same focused intensity he'd had that night in the cabin, pawing at the floorboards, insisting I listen. The final lesson came almost a year after the discovery, at a memorial service organized by the families. Not at the property, never at the property, but at a park in the nearest city, where they'd planted 29 trees, one for each woman whose life had been stolen by Harold Kettering. I stood among people who'd been strangers a year ago, but who felt like family now, connected by tragedy and closure and the strange path that had brought us all together. Each family had placed a plaque by their tree with their loved one's name, their dates, a brief message about who they'd been before they became victims. Lisa Chen, beloved daughter, aspiring teacher, forever in our hearts. Jennifer Kay, free spirit, loyal friend, taken too soon. Rachel Morrison, artist, dreamer, deeply missed. As I walked among the trees, reading the plaques, crying quietly, I realized something profound. These women hadn't just been victims. They'd been people, complete, complex, loved people with dreams and flaws and stories that mattered. Harold Kettering had tried to reduce them to photographs in a box, trophies of his power. But their families had refused to let that be their legacy. And Rex and we'd given them the chance to reclaim that narrative, to bring their daughters and sisters and wives home, to remember them as people, not mysteries. That was the real value of what we'd done. Not property, not money, not recognition, just the simple, profound gift of allowing love to complete its grieving and begin its healing. Mrs. Chen found me standing by Lisa's tree. She didn't say anything, just stood beside me, her hand finding mine. We stayed there together as the sun set, 2 people connected by a story neither of us would have chosen, but both of us had learned to carry. "Thank you for listening to your dog," she finally said, and I realized that was the ultimate lesson. Trust is everything. Trust in your partner. Trust in your training. Trust in yourself even when you're broken. Trust that sometimes the path to healing runs through the darkest places, and you have to be willing to go there anyway. Rex had trusted his nose, his instincts, his training. I'd eventually trusted him, and together, we'd done something that mattered more than either of us could have done alone. That $400 cabin had cost me everything and given me back something I didn't know I'd lost: purpose. The certainty that even when you're shattered, even when you think you've failed, you can still show up and do the work. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, that work changes the world. Not in grand, dramatic ways, but in quiet moments, like a mother finally able to say goodbye to her daughter. Like families planting trees to remember love instead of loss. Like a retired K-9 handler teaching a new generation that failure isn't the end, just a detour on the way to becoming who you're meant to be. I bent down and scratched Rex behind his ears. He looked up at me with those dark, knowing eyes, tail wagging, completely content. "Good boy," I whispered. "Such a good boy." And for the first time in 2 years, I believed I might be good too.